Have you ever had an idea for a Destiny 2 exotic and thought to yourself, boy, I sure would like some stranger on the internet to metaphorically rip this idea structurally superfluous new buttocks by critically evaluating its creativity, balance, complexity, and synergy? Well, you have a very specific yet perfectly satiable request, because that's exactly what we're gonna do. I will take your ideas from comments from subscribers, patrons, and our idea board on Discord and flesh them out and judge them. It's important to note that I will be giving ratings based on the original ideas and not the reworks that I will provide, where I will try to polish up some of the rough spots. We will start with what I feel is the least creative ideas that stood out to me and work our way up to the most creative ideas and the featured idea for the week. I hope that even if I do tear your idea apart, that you know that I'm trying to do my best to be as fair and as supportive to the idea and to you as I possibly can. We can't improve without first identifying problems, and also similarly, one thing I want to point out is just because something is considered the most creative doesn't necessarily mean that the idea is the best. All artist links are in the description below. Let's get started with the Bulwark. This is a tripod-based heavy machine gun in the heavy ammo slot. The exotic creator didn't give much details on as to like what RPM this would be, but I think a 360 RPM, being that we don't have that right now, would be sufficient. Its exotic perk is called Tripod, heavily reduced flinch, and recoil when crouched and stationary. And the exotic perk is called the Last Line, kills grant a portion of health and generate ammo. This idea, as that you're seeing here, might not be the most creative, and that's why it's the bottom of this list. It is very easy to understand what this idea is going for, which has benefits of its own, but it doesn't really have a whole lot of synergy that this is capable of baking itself into. The original idea is from a Patreon supporter named, I'm probably going to slaughter this, Malte? Regardless, some of the things that I changed is, first of all, I removed the bonus damage that this weapon gets from activating Tripod. I removed the immobilization from ADSing and just made it to where it was just part of the requirement that you shouldn't be moving in order to get this stuff to proc. And I removed the last man standing cost in order to get your health to come back, and I added that ammo return for a little bit better ad clear. The primary issues with this idea originally is that it's extremely straightforward and it doesn't play well into any particular build style. You can't really like come up with a build that really supports something like this outside of just good machine gun, which is fine, but there's a lot of competition already and you have to be able to beat out the rest of it and carve its own niche. If this machine gun was meant for ad clear, you've got Thunderlord and Heir Apparent for just general ad clear, which does probably what this is trying to do, but better, at least originally. And if this was for DPS, then you have Xenophage to compete with, which if you have this weapon just be better than Xenophage, then Xenophage loses its spot a little bit, so that balance is a bit tricky. So out of 5, creativity 1, balance 4, complexity 1, which is good, you want low complexity, and synergy 2. Not a bad idea. Straightforward ideas definitely have a place in the game. The next idea is the MR11 Isolator. Its exotic intrinsic perk is called The More. Hipfire shots create clouds of flammable gas that blind and slow enemies, and the exotic perk is called The Merrier. Shots fired when in ADS fire a small solar ball that sticks to surfaces and enemies. An interesting idea, but it has a bit of competition. The original exotic idea was based more around the general burn and it kind of being based around a Molotov cocktail. If you're not familiar, here's a picture on screen. The changes that I did is that I removed the kills to increase the fire rate and changed its functionality to a gas and light mechanic similar to Scorch from Titanfall. I also added back-end quality to allow all solar damage to light the gas, which isn't mentioned in the post itself, but this is something that could be added as sort of a side note to this exotic to help it out a little bit. The issues with this is that while this idea is interesting, it's not necessarily the most novel. We have Witherhoard, we have Prospector, we're both do kind of similar things, and for pure ad clear from the heavy ammo slot, this would compete directly with the king of ad clear and grenade launchers, which is Anarchy. Of course, this would be solar, but that's not going to be super necessary for most engagements. Note, this idea does have a lot of potential. I really like the slight rework that I applied to this here, but it just needed a bit of spice. So, out of 5 again, creativity 2, balance 4, complexity 2, and synergy 4. There's a lot of stuff you could do with burns, things like triggering the Hunter's Burning Edge perk, as well as maybe going for something like a Warmind Cell build. The next idea revives an old NPC that we have recently lost due to the Destiny Content Vault, and it shares a pretty similar idea to something that you actually probably recognize this gun from a other looter shooter based game. This is the Failsafe Protocol. Its intrinsic perk is called multifunctional. Rate of fire changes randomly. Reloading will load a random amount of rounds into the magazine. And its exotic perk is called Shot Circuit. Randomly, this weapon will fire an elemental explosive round. The original idea was pretty damn close to this one. I didn't have to do too many changes, but a small things here and there, as you can see here. The main changes that I added to this is, first of all, I essentially added Clown Cartridge to this just to add a bit more of that randomness to this weapon. I changed the arc damage on the Short Circuit perk, as well as changing around some of the names of these things, right? So that it will be able to deal any types of elemental damage randomly. The Catalyst is interesting but highly abusable, as this effectively allows you to deal damage in the area around you, getting lots of multi-kills or breaking shields for only firing one bullet in a small reload time. I also thought there's a big opportunity for a back-end lore reason for this weapon. The creator themselves did say that Failsafe would speak to the player off and on when using the weapon, which is really cool and something that we could probably integrate into the game and would be a lot of fun. We could have this weapon as sort of a sabotage to something like that Savathun is doing, where we have to take Failsafe's faulty AI and insert her in an area that's critical to Savathun's overall plans. There are some issues with this weapon, however. I see possible game-breaking issues with a kinetic weapon dealing elemental damage with basically no effort. We saw something with the Cold Front a while back where Cold Front was capable of proccing Dragonfly for no reason, so I don't know if this would break anything. I'm gonna need some PvE experts in the comment section to let me know. Creativity 3, I love the idea of a weapon that talks back to us. Also, Failsafe coming back would be kind of interesting. Balance 4, I think this is relatively balanced overall. Complexity 4, the changes in RPM could cause a bit of difficulty in using the weapon, and obviously this being a weapon that deals elemental damage from the kinetic slot could possibly be a problem. However, something that is interesting. And Synergy 2, it's somewhat difficult to play into this outside of just mods that affect it, such as like anti-barrier auto rifle or something like that. The next idea is a hunter exotic called the Sharp Shadow. The flavor text reads, "Abide in here forever." Its exotic perk is called its Reach. Converts your withering blades into a singular tomahawk with bonus freezing and precision hits, and this tomahawk also has anti-barrier. The original idea was pretty damn similar to this. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to list all of the details to this here, as I want to try to keep this on something that you can read. To fill in some of the gaps here, some of the changes that I made, first of all, I added that anti-barrier to it. The reason for this is that if you're going to run an exotic that changes the functionality or increases the power of a particular ability, you're going to want it to also be capable of dealing with champions, and my main reasoning for that is the Arthurus Embrace, which does something very similar. I added the freeze on precision hits, which could allow the hunter to play more into the freeze aspect, obviously in PvP. Being that this will kill a Guardian outright anyway, this isn't going to change anything too drastically outside of encountering a super that'll actually survive the headshot. And I added back in functionality to operate sort of similarly to the Tombstone perk that we have right now, where if you dome a target in the head with one of these things, it would also summon one of those stasis crystals. Of course, there are some issues with this. It lacked any real place in PvE without more significant bonuses, as this is pretty damn similar to the Bottom Tree Gunslinger's throwing knife, but there are some exceptions to that. Obviously, anti-barrier added to this does help it out a lot. Another issue is one I kind of already mentioned, is that in PvP, this would be pretty damn similar to Weighted Knife, in that using Whisper of Hunger with the Grim Harvest, you can almost get an entire melee charge back when you get that to proc for you, but it does obviously have some swapped around benefits. Obviously, this could give you maybe a little bit of overshield with Whisper of Rhyme. Maybe you could use Headstone to get a bit of damage resistance and a bit of your grenade energy back. So this could possibly be a problem for an easy setup for ability spam, which Bungie is obviously moving away from. But all in all, I really like this idea. Creativity 4, Balance 3, Complexity 2, very easy to understand, and Synergy 5. There's a lot of very easy synergies that this could play into. And lastly, our featured exotic of the week is another hunter exotic. This actually originally started off as a warlock exotic, but I felt like it'd be a little bit more accurate to be on a hunter, and this is the Steps of Ascendant. The flavor text reads, "May your shade at last find rest." The exotic perk is called Dreamwalker. Consume your class ability to pass through the Ascendant Realm. The Ascendant Realm is what you do when you go on certain strikes, particularly within the Dreaming City and such, where you go into that kind of like black and white filtered area, right? There's a couple different places you can see it in game. I'll put some pictures up on screen so you know exactly what I'm talking about. The original idea from Mr. Red Animations had this on a Warlock helmet. So some changes that I brought to this here is obviously I've moved this to Hunter for both activation animation reasons as well as input reasons. So think of it like this. If you wanted to actually use a normal dodge, you still could by double pressing that button. But if you wanted to activate this ability, capability. Similarly, both in terms of the button press as well as the animation to activating a rift on Warlock, you could press and hold that button, which would cause that to proc as soon as you were to quote-unquote cast that rift, but obviously no rift would be casted. I also changed the armor position to the legs, as that tends to be where movement exotics are based, and I changed the flavor text to reference a different game. There's a lot of issues associated with this that's just difficult to talk about in one video, but I'll try to list as many as I can. It's interesting, but it's not exciting in PvE unless there's something I'm just missing that is just outright game breaking. The idea is very complex as questions come up with regards to, are you able to see enemies? Are entities visible like grenades? Can you revive guardians when you're in the Ascendant realm? What about technical capabilities of the game actually being capable of handling something like this? Can you interact with the trains? Will automatic doors open for you? Is the wearer visible? Is the wearer able to fire the weapons as soon as they come out of activation? What happens if they deactivate near enemies? What if they're able of deactivating inside of enemies? Can they telefrag people? What about highlighting effects? Are you effectively invincible and invisible to where something like Eyes of Another World would be able to highlight you and see you? Or are you actually just not present? The creativity is through the roof on this one. So creativity 5, its balance is very questionable though. So 2, the complexity is also very, very high, which is not a good thing. So 5, but the synergies could be really interesting. So 3. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did like this idea, make sure that you subscribe and leave your idea down below. If you would like a better chance of getting your idea featured, check us out on Patreon. There is far fewer comments there than there are in YouTube. Thank you for liking and sharing. Bless your faces and deuces.